A black woman walks into an airport. Just another traveler trying to catch her flight. She carries herself with quiet confidence. Dressed in a sharp but understated suit. Her only jewelry a simple gold necklace. She isn't looking for special treatment, just the same courtesy as everyone else. But the airline staff see her differently. They exchange smirks, whisper under their breath, and when she checks in for her first-class ticket, the condescension is barely hidden. "First class, huh?" one of them mutters, loud enough for her to hear. She lets it slide. At security, she hears them laughing behind her back. At the gate, they go even further, questioning whether she even belongs in first class, implying she must have scammed her way in. She stays composed, calm, but when they step onto the plane, still pressing the issue, still refusing to respect her. She knows it's time. She reaches into her purse and pulls out a small, but powerful piece of identification, her U.S. Senator ID. The smirks vanish. Their faces drain of color. The flight crew goes silent. In an instant, the power shifts. They weren't just mocking any passenger. They were harassing a sitting United States senator. What happened next changed everything and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you believe respect should be given to everyone, no matter who they are. Hit subscribe because this story is far from over. Senator Alia Johnson had always been a woman who traveled light. No entourage, no flashy displays of power, just a carry-on, a well-worn briefcase, and the quiet confidence of a woman who had fought for everything she had. That morning, as she walked through the automatic doors of Chicago's O'Hare International Airport, she was just another passenger. Another traveler navigating the chaos of modern air travel. The familiar sights and sounds surrounded her, the hum of rolling suitcases, the distant chatter of announcements, the occasional frustrated sigh of someone realizing their flight had been delayed. It was a place where thousands of lives intersected, where strangers brushed past one another, each carrying their own story. Alia had always found airports fascinating. Little crossroads of humanity where people from every background, every income bracket, and every part of the country stood side by side, united by the universal experience of travel. But she also knew that some people like her moved through these spaces differently. Not because they wanted to, but because the world made it so. It was in the way eyes lingered a little too long when she stepped into first class. In the way clerks hesitated just slightly before handing back her credit card. In the way security sometimes asked her to step aside for an extra check. Small things, barely noticeable if you weren't paying attention. But Alia had spent a lifetime paying attention. That morning, she was running on little sleep. Her schedule stacked with back-to-back meetings once she landed in Washington, D.C. There was no room for error. No time for unnecessary distractions. She approached the check-in kiosk, punched in her reservation code, and watched as her flight details popped up on the screen. First class, aisle seat, paid in full. She preferred the extra space not for luxury, but for practicality. In those quiet hours in the air, she could comb through committee reports, answer urgent emails, and mentally prepare for the battles that awaited her on the Senate floor. But before she could even retrieve her boarding pass, a voice cut through her morning haze. "ID, please." The tone was flat, impersonal, but it was the lack of eye contact that caught her attention first. The man behind the counter, his name tag read Jacob, barely looked up from the screen in front of him. Beside him, a young woman named Shannon scrolled through her phone, only half engaged in her job. Alia handed over her driver's license, watching as Jacob barely glanced at it before typing something into the computer. A small frown crossed his face, and then a soft, almost imperceptible snort of amusement. He exchanged a glance with Shannon, who smirked before looking back at her phone. Alia had been in politics long enough to recognize that look. The quiet, condescending kind, the kind that said, "You don't belong here." She had seen it in corporate boardrooms when she was the only black woman in the room. She had felt it in country clubs where she was invited but never truly welcome. And now, here it was, in an airport, coming from two airline employees who didn't know her name, her title, or the weight she carried behind her smile. "First class, huh?" Jacob said, printing her bag tag but making no move to assist further. Shannon giggled softly, shaking her head as if the idea was laughable. Alia exhaled, steadying herself. She could let it go. She had let things like this go before. But a small voice inside her whispered that this wasn't just about her. It never was. It was about the grandmother with tired feet who got questioned every time she tried to board early. It was about the young man in a hoodie who got asked, "Are you sure you're in the right line?" at every airport lounge. It was about the unspoken assumptions that crept into everyday interactions, shaping the way people moved through the world. So she looked Jacob squarely in the eyes and smiled, not an apologetic smile. Not a submissive smile, but the kind of smile that said, "I see you. I see exactly what you're doing." "Is there a problem with my ticket?" she asked. Her voice calm, even. Jacob hesitated. "No problem," he muttered, but his tone said otherwise. She took her bag tag, thanked them politely, and walked away, feeling their eyes on her back. Maybe that was the end of it. Maybe it was just another small moment. Another drop in the ocean of everyday biases that people like her had learned to navigate. But deep down, she suspected that this wasn't over. Some people, when they were confronted with their own biases, grew embarrassed and moved on. Others doubled down. As she made her way toward security, she reminded herself of something her father used to say: respect isn't given. It's shown. And if people won't show it to you, you make them see you anyway. Alia Johnson moved through the airport with the quiet assurance of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating spaces not built for her. She had learned long ago that dignity was something you carried with you, not something you waited for the world to hand you. She adjusted the strap of her purse, pulling her carry-on behind her, eyes forward, her mind already shifting toward the day ahead. A Senate committee hearing, a stack of policy briefings, the constant balancing act of fighting for the people who had elected her while sidestepping the distractions that came with power. But today, the distraction had found her first. The TSA line was moving faster than expected, a rare blessing in the controlled chaos of airport security. She placed her laptop and shoes into the plastic bins, keeping her posture relaxed, but her senses alert. Old habits. She had learned to read a room before a single word was spoken, a skill that had saved her more times than she could count. That was when she heard it. A soft laugh, a whisper just loud enough to carry. "First class." "Sure," someone murmured behind her. Alia didn't turn immediately. She had heard things like this before, in hushed tones at exclusive events, in casual jokes that weren't jokes at all. The unspoken message was always the same: you don't look like you belong. She glanced slightly over her shoulder, and there they were, Jacob and Shannon, the same airline employees from the check-in counter, now off duty but still lingering like a shadow she couldn't shake. Shannon leaned in toward Jacob, grinning as if sharing some inside joke. Jacob smirked, his eyes flicking toward Alia's modest, well-worn carry-on. "The nerve of some people," Shannon muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "Bet she scammed some upgrade or something." Alia inhaled slowly, steadying herself. Her father had taught her that some battles weren't worth fighting, but he had also taught her that silence had a weight of its own. She could ignore them, she could let it go, chalk it up to ignorance and move on. But ignoring a problem had never solved it. Problems like this didn't fade, they festered. They grew in the spaces where people chose to look away. She collected her things from the conveyor belt, slipping her shoes back on with slow, deliberate movements. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting to see if she would react, waiting to see if she would shrink under the weight of their assumptions. But shrinking had never been her way. She lifted her head, turned toward them, and met their gaze directly. There was a moment of silence. A flicker of something in Jacob's eyes. Was it discomfort? Was it realization? It was gone as quickly as it had come, replaced by indifference. Shannon, however, didn't flinch. She held onto her smirk like a shield, as if daring Alia to make something of it. Alia had faced senators who underestimated her, political opponents who tried to undermine her at every turn. She had stood on debate stages where men interrupted her, spoke over her, dismissed her. She had walked into rooms where people had assumed she was the assistant, not the decision-maker. She had faced far worse than a pair of petty airline employees who mistook their authority for power. She took a step forward, closing the space between them just slightly. Not enough to be aggressive, but enough to make it clear she was not afraid to stand in her own skin. "You might want to be careful," she said, her voice calm, almost conversational. "Assumptions have a way of catching up with you." Shannon's smirk faltered for just a second. Jacob shifted his weight, looking away. They had expected her to ignore it, to let it pass. They weren't used to people like her pushing back. Alia didn't linger. She had made her point. She turned, walking away with the same steady stride. Her pulse even, her shoulders squared. She wasn't looking for a fight. But she also wasn't in the business of letting people strip away her dignity piece by piece. As she reached the terminal, she allowed herself a breath, exhaling the weight of the moment. She had always believed that the true test of character wasn't in grand gestures, but in these small, everyday moments. It was in how you responded when no one was watching, in whether you stood up for yourself when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Her phone buzzed a message from her chief of staff. Vanessa, back-to-back meetings as soon as you land. Be ready. She smiled to herself. I always am. Alia Johnson had spent her life walking into rooms where she wasn't expected to belong. Boardrooms filled with men who mistook her for an assistant. Senate chambers where she was the only black woman in the room. Neighborhood meetings where people hesitated before recognizing her as their elected representative. She knew the feeling of being judged before speaking, being measured by things that had nothing to do with ability, intelligence, or experience, and she knew how to hold her ground. But there was something about airports, about travel, that made these moments feel even more blatant. It was supposed to be a level playing field. A ticket was a ticket. A seat was a seat. But for some, even that wasn't enough. She walked toward gate 12, her rolling carry-on humming softly against the polished airport floor, her mind shifting from the morning's tension to the hours ahead. There was a hearing to prepare for, a policy proposal that could bring real change to small business owners in struggling communities. She reminded herself why she did this work, why she fought for people who didn't have the platform she did. But just as she settled into the familiar rhythm of focus, she caught sight of a woman approaching her. The crisp navy uniform, the gold name tag. This was an airline employee. Excuse me, ma'am, the woman said, her voice warm but cautious. I just wanted to say I saw what happened back at check-in. And I just want you to know. That wasn't right. Alia took a breath, leveling her gaze with the woman's. Her name tag read Carol. I appreciate you saying that, Alia replied, sensing the hesitation in Carol's posture. The way her hands clasped together in front of her as if debating whether she should be having this conversation at all. Carol lowered her voice, glancing around before continuing. I don't know exactly what they said, but I saw the way they looked at you. I've worked here long enough to know when something's off. And those two? Jacob and Shannon? They've had complaints before. Alia wasn't surprised. Bias didn't just appear out of nowhere, it was a pattern. A thread woven through daily interactions. Emboldened by the idea that no one would push back. I don't have direct authority over them, Carol continued, but I just wanted to say if anything else happens, I'll be stationed near the gate. You can come find me. It was a small gesture, but it landed heavier than Carol probably realized. Not because Alia needed protection, she had been standing up for herself long before she had a title before her name, but because it was a reminder that there were always people willing to do the right thing. Even in small ways. Thank you, Carol, she said, offering a genuine smile. I hope I won't need to take you up on that. But I appreciate it. Carol nodded, offering a reassuring pat on the arm before heading back toward her post. And as Alia watched her go, she thought about how change didn't always come in sweeping legislation or landmark court rulings. Sometimes, it started in a quiet moment like this, one person choosing to notice, to speak up, to be a witness when it mattered. She found a seat near the window and set her briefcase on her lap. Flipping it open to skim her notes, the noise of the terminal hummed around her, families wrangling excited children. Business travelers pacing with Bluetooth earpieces. Announcements crackling over the intercom. Life moving forward, moment by moment. She took a sip of her coffee, willing herself to let go of the tension, to redirect her energy where it was needed. But then, as if on cue, she heard the familiar sound of laughter. Low, knowing, careless. She looked up, and there they were. Jacob and Shannon stood at the gate podium, their uniforms now paired with smug expressions. They weren't looking at her directly, but she could feel their presence like a stone in her shoe, small enough to ignore if she really wanted to, but impossible to forget. Jacob leaned into Shannon, whispering something that made her chuckle under her breath. They cast quick glances across the waiting area, their body language dripping with the kind of arrogance that came from never having been held accountable. Alia felt her fingers tighten around her coffee cup. Not from rage, but from something deeper: exhaustion. The exhaustion of knowing that no matter how accomplished you were, no matter how many barriers you broke, there would always be people who saw only what they wanted to see. Who assumed you had to prove yourself again and again. She exhaled slowly, setting her coffee down with deliberate care. There were 100 ways to handle this moment. She could ignore them, pretend she hadn't heard, let it roll off her back like so many moments before. But then what? They would keep doing it. To her, to the next person, to someone without the platform she had. She closed her briefcase and stood, smoothing the front of her blazer before walking toward the gate podium. The air shifted around her as passengers noticed her movement, eyes flicking between her and the two employees who were too busy indulging in their own amusement to see what was coming. Alia wasn't looking for a fight, but she was done pretending not to see. Alia had never been one to seek out conflict, but she had also never been one to back away from it when it found her. She moved toward the gate podium with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime choosing her battles wisely. The hum of the airport faded into the background, the distant crackle of announcements. The soft clatter of rolling suitcases. The rhythmic shuffle of impatient travelers shifting from foot to foot. None of it mattered. What mattered was the two people standing in front of her, oblivious to the moment that was about to shift beneath their feet. Jacob was tapping at the keyboard, his expression one of practiced disinterest, while Shannon leaned against the counter, her phone in hand, barely pretending to work. They weren't expecting her. They weren't expecting anyone to challenge them. That was the thing about people who wielded small power carelessly: they assumed no one would call them on it. "Excuse me," Alia said, her voice even but firm. Shannon glanced up first, her smile still hovering at the edges of her lips, not quite realizing yet that this was not going to go the way she thought. Jacob followed, his fingers still resting on the keyboard as he took in the sight of the woman they had dismissed just moments ago now standing in front of them. Unmoving. "I wanted to clarify something," Alia continued, keeping her tone professional, measured. "Back at check-in, I noticed a certain attitude toward my presence in first class. And again, just now, I overheard comments that seemed directed at me. If there's a problem with my ticket, I'd like to hear it directly." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The smirk on Shannon's face flickered, a crack forming in the shield of amusement she had been wearing all morning. Jacob cleared his throat, his fingers resuming their unnecessary tapping. "There's no problem," he muttered, not quite meeting her eyes. "Are you sure?" Alia pressed, letting the silence between them stretch just a second longer than was comfortable. "Because the way you've been looking at me, talking about me, suggests otherwise." Shannon's bravado faltered just slightly. "We weren't talking about you," she lied, shifting her weight, crossing her arms over her chest as if that could somehow shield her from the weight of accountability. Alia let out a quiet breath, a lifetime of experience telling her exactly how this was going to play out. They weren't going to apologize, not really. They weren't going to admit what they had done. That wasn't how these things worked. People like Jacob and Shannon thrived on plausible deniability. On the ability to say, "Oh, you must have misunderstood," or "it was just a joke." But that didn't mean they wouldn't remember this moment. That didn't mean they wouldn't think twice before making someone else feel unwelcome in a space they had every right to be in. "I want to be clear about something," she said, her voice low enough that only they could hear, but steady enough that there was no mistaking the weight behind it. "I don't need validation from either of you. I know exactly where I belong. But you should consider this every time you make assumptions about someone. Every time you let your biases dictate how you treat them, you're showing the world exactly who you are. And sooner or later, that catches up to people." Jacob swallowed hard, his fingers curling into a loose fist on the counter. Shannon looked away, suddenly fascinated with something on her phone that she wasn't actually reading. Alia didn't wait for a response. She had made her point, and she had no interest in giving them the satisfaction of knowing whether or not they had rattled her. She turned on her heel, walking back toward her seat, her shoulders squared, her breath steady. She didn't have to win every battle, but she wasn't going to pretend this one didn't exist. And as she settled back into her seat, she reminded herself of something her mother used to say: "You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. You just have to stand tall enough that they can't ignore you." The boarding announcement crackled over the speakers, cutting through the hum of idle conversations and the occasional clatter of a rolling suitcase. Alia stood, smoothing the front of her blazer, adjusting the strap of her purse, and pulling her carry-on behind her. This was routine. She had boarded countless flights, walked down countless jet bridges, settled into countless seats, but this time, she felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing against her back. She didn't have to turn around to know that Shannon and Jacob were watching. People like them always watched, always eager to see if their quiet hostility had left a mark. She moved with the same quiet confidence she had always carried, stepping toward the first-class line. The couple in front of her, an older man in a beige windbreaker and his wife, adjusting her silk scarf, handed over their boarding passes without issue. The agent at the gate, now standing where Shannon and Jacob had been moments earlier, smiled, scanned them in, and waved them through. No hesitation, no questions, just a simple, smooth transaction, the way it was supposed to be. Then it was Aaliyah's turn. She handed over her boarding pass, waiting for the familiar beep of approval. But instead, there was a pause, a glance, a hesitation, not from the new gate agent, but from Shannon, who had taken it upon herself to stand just a few feet away. Watching, waiting, arms crossed over her chest like she was evaluating a contestant in a game she thought she had already won. First class? Shannon mused, voice laced with mock surprise, her gaze flicking between Alia and the screen. Interesting. Jacob, now standing at another terminal, leaned in as if peering at something deeply concerning. Yeah, he added, too casually. We've had some issues with people trying to, get into first class without the right credentials. The statement was laced with implication, with a message so clear it didn't need to be spoken outright. The people in line behind Alia shifted slightly, sensing the tension but unsure if they should intervene. The couple who had boarded before her stood just inside the jet bridge, watching, waiting to see how this played out. Alia inhaled deeply, her patience stretching thin. She had spent her life in spaces where she had to prove herself over and over, where the presumption of legitimacy was never granted, only earned, even in places where it should have been automatic. She could feel the heat rising behind her ribs, the familiar sting of injustice settling into her bones. But she also knew that anger, unchecked and unleashed, rarely worked in her favor. She tilted her head slightly, offering Shannon the kind of look that had once stopped political opponents mid-sentence on the Senate floor. Is there an issue with my boarding pass? She asked, her tone smooth as glass. Shannon hesitated for a split second, long enough for Alia to see it, to recognize that beneath the smug exterior, there was a flicker of uncertainty. Well, Shannon finally said, plastering on a tight smile, we just like to double-check these things. You understand. Jacob, emboldened, added, some people use miles they don't actually have, or points that don't belong to them. Just making sure everything is in order. Alia felt the weight of the moment press against her, the subtle challenge in their words, the test they thought they were giving her. But what they didn't know, what they had never considered, was that she had been tested her entire life. And she had never failed. She pulled her phone from her purse with measured precision, scrolling through her digital wallet, then held up the confirmation receipt, the one that showed the payment, the seat assignment, the account number tied to her name. Everything is in order, she said, her voice steady, unwavering. Would you like to check again? Or are we done here? The silence stretched, a shift in the air. Jacob's smug expression faltered. Shannon's lips pressed together, her eyes flicking toward the actual gate agent, who was now watching the interaction with growing discomfort. There was no excuse left to hide behind. No justification that wouldn't sound exactly like what it was. Without another word, the beep finally came. The boarding pass was scanned. The path was cleared. But before Alia stepped forward, she leaned in just slightly. Just enough so that only Shannon and Jacob could hear. You should be careful, she said, her voice quiet but sharp. Because assumptions have a way of catching up with people. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. She walked forward, her posture tall, her steps steady, and as she crossed the threshold into the jet bridge, she knew that they would remember this moment, not because she had raised her voice, not because she had caused a scene, but because she had stood her ground and refused to let them shrink her. She had always believed that real power didn't come from demanding respect, it came from making sure people had no choice but to give it. The first-class cabin was quiet, the kind of quiet that made people feel important. Plush leather seats, carefully folded blankets, the faint scent of citrus from a freshly wiped tray table. It was a space designed for ease, for the assumption that those who sat there belonged. Alia settled into seat 2A, stowing her briefcase beside her, adjusting the small pillow behind her back. She was used to this space. She had worked for it, paid for it, earned it in every possible way. And yet, as she fastened her seatbelt, she felt the lingering residue of something unwelcome, the weight of judgment that had followed her from the terminal to this very moment. A flight attendant named Tony approached, his smile warm, professional. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Johnson. Can I offer you something to drink before takeoff? Water, juice, champagne?" She appreciated his kindness, the simple dignity of good service. "Water, please," she said, offering a nod. Tony returned moments later, placing a chilled bottle and a plastic cup on her tray table with quiet efficiency. She thanked him, letting the cold seep into her fingertips. Grounding herself, she had navigated a lifetime of moments like this, moments where she was forced to remind people that she belonged. But this time, she could feel something in the air, an unfinished tension, a thread that had not yet been cut. And then, they appeared. Jacob and Shannon stepped into the cabin, moving with an air of authority they didn't possess. It was unusual. Gate agents didn't board flights unless there was an issue. Alia watched, her pulse steady, as they approached Tony at the front of the cabin, whispering something in hushed but urgent tones. Tony's expression shifted, confusion flickering across his face. He glanced toward Alia, then back at the two employees who were clearly out of place. Alia didn't have to hear what they were saying. She already knew. Tony hesitated, then walked toward her seat. His voice lowered but careful. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his tone apologetic, "I'm so sorry to bother you. But they're asking to verify your seat assignment again. They're saying there may have been an error on the manifest." The words settled over her like a heavy, familiar weight. An error on the manifest. The kind of excuse people used when they wanted to question something without saying the quiet part out loud. She inhaled, slow and measured, and reached for her phone, pulling up her boarding pass once more. She had shown it at check-in. She had shown it at the gate. And now, here she was again, being asked to prove herself again. She extended the screen toward Tony, her voice controlled but firm. "Everything should be in order." Tony scanned the code with his handheld device. A soft beep confirmed what they all already knew. Her name, her seat, her right to be exactly where she was. Tony turned back to Shannon and Jacob. "She's fine," he said, a note of finality in his voice. "Seat 2A is confirmed." But Shannon's expression remained hard, unreadable. Jacob shifted beside her, his jaw tightening. They weren't satisfied. They weren't done. Alia exhaled, steadying herself. And then she made a choice. She reached into her purse, past her wallet, past her phone, to the small leather pouch that carried something far more powerful than a boarding pass. When she pulled it out, she didn't do it for theatrics. She did it because she was finished playing their game. She held up her United States Senate ID. A silence fell over the cabin, thick and immediate. The gold-embossed seal of the U.S. Senate caught the cabin light, gleaming under their stunned gazes. "You want proof?" Alia asked, her voice calm but unmistakably edged with steel. "I'm Senator Alia Johnson of Michigan. This is my seat. This is my flight. And you," she continued, her gaze steady on Shannon and Jacob, "are about 10 seconds away from a serious problem." Jacob's face drained of color. Shannon's mouth opened, then closed. Like she was struggling to form a sentence she suddenly realized she no longer had the authority to complete. Alia didn't move, didn't blink. She let the silence stretch. Let them sit in it. Let them realize, in real time, exactly how badly they had misjudged her. Then, slowly, deliberately, she returned her Senate ID to her purse and folded her hands in her lap. "If we're done here," she said, her voice unwavering, "I'd like to enjoy my flight." Tony, to his credit, recovered quickly. "Yes, ma'am," he said, stepping aside with the efficiency of someone who had just realized which side of history he wanted to be on. Shannon and Jacob, however, lingered for half a second too long, as if waiting for an escape route that didn't exist. Then, without another word, they turned and walked off the plane, their backs stiff, their steps hurried. Alia let out a quiet breath. But she didn't relax, not yet. She had made her point. But the real reckoning was still ahead. She knew how this worked. The fallout was coming. and she would be ready. As the plane taxied toward the runway, she glanced out the window. The city lights stretching far beyond the airport, sprawling toward the horizon. She had always known that power wasn't about the title you held or the office you occupied, it was about the way you carried yourself when others tried to take it from you. And tonight, she had carried herself exactly as she had always intended. The wheels touched down at Reagan National Airport with a soft jolt. The familiar sensation of arrival settling into Aaliyah's bones. She had made this trip more times than she could count. Flying between Michigan and Washington. Moving between the worlds of policy and people. Between power and the everyday struggles of those she fought for. But tonight, as the plane taxied toward the gate, she knew this landing carried more weight. It wasn't just another arrival. It was the beginning of a reckoning. She remained seated as the flight attendants went through their final announcements. Her hands resting lightly on her briefcase. She could feel the quiet glances from other passengers. The silent recognition of what had just unfolded. A few rows ahead, a businessman who had witnessed the confrontation gave her a subtle nod, respect unspoken but understood. A young woman across the aisle, clutching a well-worn novel, offered a hesitant but knowing smile. These were the moments that reminded her why she never let things slide. Why she never allowed casual bias to go unchecked. Because for every battle she fought, there were others watching. Others who might one day find themselves in the same position. As the seatbelt sign flicked off, she stood, collecting her belongings with practiced ease. The first-class cabin emptied quickly. And as she stepped toward the exit, she was met by Tony, the flight attendant who had watched everything unfold. His face was tight with quiet concern. "Senator Johnson," he said, lowering his voice, "I just wanted to say I'm really sorry for what happened back there. That should never have happened to you. To anyone." Aaliyah paused, taking in the sincerity in his voice. She had long learned to distinguish between empty apologies and genuine remorse. This, she could tell, was the latter. "I appreciate that, Tony," she said, adjusting the strap of her purse. "But you're right, it shouldn't happen to anyone. And I intend to make sure it doesn't." He nodded, stepping aside as she exited the plane. The cool air of the jet bridge met her, crisp and grounding, and then she saw her. A woman stood at the gate, dressed in a crisp navy blazer. The American Airlines logo pinned neatly to her lapel. Her name tag read Rachel Smith, Customer Relations Manager. Aaliyah had dealt with people like her before, damage control specialists, trained to smooth things over before they spiraled into public relations disasters. "Senator Johnson," Rachel said, extending a hand with a carefully measured expression. "I'd like to personally apologize for what happened on your flight. I understand you had an issue with 2 of our employees." Aaliyah shook her hand, firm but brief. "An issue," she repeated, letting the word hang in the air just long enough to make it clear how inadequate it was. "That's one way to put it." Rachel inhaled, nodding slightly. "I'd like to discuss this with you further," she said, "if you have a moment. We have a quiet area just down the hall." Aaliyah had no intention of brushing this aside. She walked beside Rachel, her heels clicking steadily against the polished airport floor. They reached a small lounge, away from the flow of arriving passengers, and Rachel gestured for her to take a seat. "I want to be clear," Aaliyah said as she settled into the chair, setting her briefcase down beside her. "This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was bias, plain and simple. Your employees made it clear, through their words and actions, that they did not believe I belonged in first class. They harassed me at check-in. They whispered about me at security. They attempted to humiliate me at the gate. And when all of that failed, they came onto the plane to try again." Rachel kept her posture composed, though Aaliyah could see the tension in her jaw. "I understand how unacceptable this is," she said carefully. "We take incidents like this very seriously." Aaliyah arched a brow. "Do you?" "Because from what I've been told, those 2 have had complaints before." Rachel hesitated. "I won't deny that there have been past concerns," she admitted, "but I can assure you, now that this has been escalated, there will be an immediate internal investigation." Aaliyah leaned forward slightly. "Good, because I want a formal complaint filed. And I want to know exactly how American Airlines plans to address this, not just with them, but with your overall policies. This isn't about me. I'm a U.S. Senator. I have a platform. But what about the people who don't? What about the woman who saved up for a first-class ticket only to be treated like she stole it?" What about the young man who gets stopped at the gate because someone assumes he must be in the wrong line? What happens to them? Rachel's expression tightened, and for the first time, Alia saw something that wasn't just corporate professionalism, something that resembled real understanding. I hear you, she said, exhaling slowly, and I agree. This is bigger than one incident. I won't pretend we don't have work to do. Alia nodded, watching her carefully. Then do the work. Rachel straightened. Shannon and Jacob have already been placed on immediate suspension pending investigation. She said, if they're found in violation of our code of conduct, their employment will be terminated. Additionally, we're implementing a refresher training on bias and professionalism for all customer-facing employees. And I'd like to invite you to be a part of that discussion if you're open to it. Alia considered her for a long moment. She wasn't interested in empty gestures, in corporate lip service designed to pacify bad press. But if this was real, if there was a chance to push for systemic change, then she would take it. I'll think about it, she said finally. But know this, I'll be watching. Rachel nodded. Understood. Alia stood, adjusting the strap of her bag once more, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her spine. She had fought for legislation that took years to pass. She had faced political battles that stretched on for months. But some fights like this one happened in the space of a single day. In a single airport, over a single flight, and they mattered just as much. As she walked away, her phone buzzed. A message from her chief of staff. Vanessa. Media inquiries are piling up. CNN, The Washington Post, MSNBC. Everyone wants a statement. How do you want to handle this? Alia glanced over her shoulder once, back toward Rachel, then toward the bustling terminal ahead of her. She had spent her career choosing which battles to fight. This one had just begun. The newsroom lights were hot. The cameras positioned at precise angles. The air in the press briefing room charged with anticipation. Alia Johnson had stood in front of countless microphones before, had faced questions sharper than steel, had debated policy with some of the most powerful figures in Washington. But today wasn't about legislation. Today wasn't about a carefully worded political strategy. Today was about something much simpler and much more profound. It was about dignity, about what happens when people think they can decide who belongs and who doesn't. About the small, daily aggressions that reveal bigger, more dangerous truths. She stepped to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and let the murmuring crowd settle. The journalists before her, notebooks open, cameras rolling, had already written half their stories in their heads. A sitting U.S. senator racially profiled by airline staff? It was the kind of headline that sparked outrage. That fueled the endless news cycle. That made people shake their heads for a day or two before moving on. But Alia wasn't interested in a 24-hour scandal. She was interested in something more lasting. She cleared her throat, her voice steady but unflinching. Yesterday, I experienced what too many people in this country have experienced. I was questioned, doubted, and humiliated, not because of my actions, not because of any mistake on my part, but because two airline employees made assumptions about who I was and where I belonged. A murmur rippled through the room, pens scratching across paper, fingers tapping notes into laptops. I want to be very clear, she continued, her gaze sweeping the room. This is not just about me. I am a U.S. senator. I have a platform. When I push back, people listen. But what about the people who don't? What about the single mother who is questioned at the boarding gate because someone assumes she couldn't possibly have bought that ticket? What about the black teenager pulled aside at security, asked to step out of line, frisked for no reason other than a gut feeling? What about the veterans, the elderly, the disabled passengers who are treated like an inconvenience rather than human beings deserving of respect? Silence. The kind of silence that meant people were listening. For too long, we've allowed this kind of treatment to be excused, ignored, or explained away. We've accepted apologies with no real change. We've been told, time and time again, that these are just misunderstandings. But let me ask you, how many times do we allow the same misunderstanding before we acknowledge the truth? This is not about training. This is not about bad customer service. This is about bias. It's about the deep, ingrained assumptions that make some people believe they have the right to question someone else's legitimacy. And it has to stop. A journalist from the Washington Post raised a hand. Senator Johnson, American Airlines has already announced the termination of the two employees involved. Do you believe that's enough? Alia met the reporter's gaze. Consequences matter, she said, but consequences without systemic change are just band-aids on a deeper wound. This isn't just about 2 employees. It's about an entire industry that needs to reckon with its practices. How are frontline workers trained? How are customer interactions monitored? Who holds companies accountable when they fail their passengers? Firing 2 people won't fix this problem. Structural accountability will. Another reporter, this time from CNN, leaned forward. Senator, do you plan to take legislative action? Should Congress be involved in regulating bias in customer service? Alia let out a slow breath. Bias isn't just an airline problem. It's a societal problem. It happens in stores, in hospitals, in corporate offices, on sidewalks, and yes, in airports. My job as a legislator is to create policies that ensure fairness and equity. But my job as a citizen, as a human being, is to demand that we stop pretending this isn't happening. So, to answer your question, yes, I will be looking at how we address discrimination in consumer industries. And I will be expecting corporations to step up on their own, without waiting for Congress to force them. A voice from the back of the room called out, Senator, what do you say to those who think this was just a misunderstanding? That maybe this was just standard procedure? Alia let a small, knowing smile cross her lips. I say this when a system repeatedly fails the same kinds of people in the same kinds of ways. It's not a coincidence. It's a pattern, and patterns demand change. She let the words hang in the air. Let them settle into the minds of those who would write the headlines. Who would shape the public conversation? She knew the cycle, the outrage, the debate, the corporate statement filled with empty promises. And then, the forgetting, until it happened again. But not this time. She stepped back from the microphone, ignoring the flurry of hands still raised, the reporters still shouting follow-up questions. She had said what she needed to say. Now, it was time to see who was actually listening. As she exited the briefing room, her phone buzzed. A message from Rachel Smith, the American Airlines executive she had met the night before. Senator Johnson, we are officially launching a full review of bias incidents within our airline. We would like to invite you to be part of the advisory board shaping our new policies. Let me know if you're willing to have that conversation. Alia stopped in the middle of the hallway, the noise of the press fading behind her. She exhaled, considering she had spent her career in battle on the Senate floor, in communities fighting for change, in rooms where she had to prove her worth over and over. And yet, some of the most important battles weren't fought in high-profile debates or congressional votes. Sometimes, they were fought in the quiet moments, in airports, in boardrooms, in the everyday spaces where dignity was either upheld or stripped away. She typed her response, brief but certain. I'm willing, but I'm not interested in talk. I'm interested in real change. Let me know when you're ready for that. She hit send, slipped her phone into her bag, and stepped forward, because progress only happens when people refuse to stand still.